In ancient Rome, there is a poet. What we now call Western civilization is just beginning to find its first roots to take hold. There's an academy, and Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle are writing books that will be read for centuries. In fact, books that we still read and talk and think about today. And in this line of thinkers, and just around the time of Jesus, is our poet. His stars rising and then crossed, the Encyclopedia Brittanica documents his rise. Quote, "No single work of literature has done more to transmit the riches of the Greek imagination to posterity. By 8 CE, the Metamorphoses were complete, if not yet formally published." End quote. The poet doesn't yet know the impact that his work will have. He can only know that his work is just now coming to an end. Its fate, like that of the heroes that he's writing about, is not going to get a final destination unscathed. Britannica continues, quote, "And it was at that moment when Ovid seemed securely placed on the pinnacle of a successful achievement that he was banished to Tomis by the emperor," end quote. The work would have to be finished in exile, and his travails would not end there. The emperor would ban the books from the public libraries. He'd write his own autobiography, and the title would be Sorrow. But history has a way of turning a censor's work into folly. You can try to ban books, but you can't stop ideas. And when a good book finds its audience, that genie will not go back into the bottle. I'm going to keep reading from the Encyclopedia Brittanica entry. Our poet's quote, "Chief appeal stems from the humanity of his writing, its gaiety, its sympathy, its exuberance, its pictorial and sensuous quality. It is those things that have recommended him down the ages to the troubadours and the poets of courtly love, from Geoffrey Chaucer, William Shakespeare, Wolfgang Van Goethe, and Ezra Pound," end quote. Ew, really? Ezra Pound? Yuck. That dude was a racist monster who sucked in all the ways that our poet did not. You probably cut it by now, but the poet's name was Ovid. And in the 12th and 13th centuries, it was called the Age of Ovid. And then he flourished again in the Renaissance. So much for your attempted censorship, Emperor. The book he wrote was called Metamorphoses, and in there is the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice. Among those who would not share the emperor's scorn for his work was Aeneas Mitchell, who would pick up the tale in 2006 and turn it into a Broadway smash hit a decade later. And today, we'll learn where that story came from. I'm John Brushke, and you are listening to Theater History and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. Okay, this is the part where I make my ongoing plea for your help in promoting this show. I really can't do it without you. The show's doing pretty well. It's getting some traction. The people who find it and, have that spot in their brain that this is scratching are really taking to the show. And I appreciate that and all your support. But every podcaster says this because it is true that if you can give us a rating, if you can post a good episode onto your own social media, if you can just tell your friends about things you like about the show or things that you have discovered on the show and point them in our direction, that would really make a huge difference. Our plan for this moment is to get Hadestown in 8 different parts. That is what the next 8 episodes are all going to be about Hadestown. This is the first post-mega musical that we're going to be talking about. Everything else has kind of entered the canon, like the great musicals of all time, the Cats that runs for decades and whatnot. And Hadestown is the first contemporary show that we're going to do. I'm excited to get to it, and there is more than enough to talk about for at least those next 8 episodes. Now, I have promised that I will always go into the ghost story and explore the strange and the mysterious. Well, in this show, everybody literally goes to hell and comes back, so most of the mysteries are historical. The ghost story is just kind of right there front and center. If you want to know where's the ghost story in Hadestown, well, they go to hell. That's pretty much the ghost story there, but there's still plenty to know about and plenty of important choices that are going to tell us about theater and life. Now, this show is, of course, about a Greek myth, And to get that myth to a contemporary audience and convert it into a musical, Mitchell had to make some important theatrical choices. And to fully understand the depth of those decisions, we are going to need to fully understand where those original myths came from. You got to know the origins of the story. And so the two things that we're going to tackle today are Greek and Roman civilization and Greek and Roman myths, or at least the myths of those characters that are involved in Hadestown. That's for today. The next show is going to be a comparison of the two original versions of the story, which came from a poet named Virgil and from our friend Ovid. And just as a precursor, a little tease of things to come, Ovid and Virgil had very different takes on the Orpheus story, and those are going to present Aeneas Williams with some important choices to make. She, of course, handled them well, but let's figure out what those choices are before we race to figuring out how she got it right. Okay, so to understand the Greek myths, you got to know a little bit about Greek history. And so to get us from Greece to Rome, we're going to rely on Neil Middleton. He's from the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, and he's got an MA in ancient history, and his account goes like this. There is a Bronze Age. It's from 3000 to 1100 BC, and of course the numbers go backwards. There's a 3000 is long ago, 1100 is sooner. There are various civilizations during that time, but that's not really our concern. The big turning point is that at about 1200 BC is the Trojan War. Homer, of course, is going to write about these, but not for centuries. These are the first two real narratives that appear in the canon of Western civilization. And interestingly, I say this as a former debate coach, both of them start with debates, and one of them starts with two. The Odyssey starts first with a debate amongst the gods, and secondly with a debate amongst the people of Athens who are deciding what to do about the Trojan War. Okay, anyway, this is not about the Trojan War. Homer's going to write about that. That happens in 1200 BC. This is followed by a period called the Greek Dark Ages. So this is when things aren't really going well. And then a bunch of Greek city-states arise. There's intellectual and cultural growth. You've heard of some of these cities. They are Athens and Sparta and Corinth and Thebes. They are just coming into their own, but they're not really a unified thing. And then around 775 to 750, the first Olympic Games are held. And this is when Homer writes the Iliad and the Odyssey. So notice he's now like 500 years away from the Trojan War. That was 1200 BC. And he's writing, and it's about 750 BC. So some time has passed between the events of the Trojan War and what Homer has to say about them. Athens then has democracy break out around 500 BC. The Athenian democracy, the first big experiment in democracy, happens, or at least the first big one that we got a bunch of books about. This is followed by the classical period. So that's 480 to about 323. And in this time, Greek drama starts to flourish. They build the Parthenon. This is when Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are around. In fact, Plato founds the first academy in 387 BCE. So there's now such a thing as a university, which means there's now such a thing as a place where people are writing books, doing scholarship, thinking about things, and making that a full-time endeavor. In 336 to 323 BC, so that's a decent chunk of time, and right after the founding of the Greek Academy, Alexander the Great conquers Persia and Egypt and beyond. There is now a Greek empire. Greek cultural and military dominance are now at their peak. Let's call this the Alexandrian era. That will become important later when we compare poets. And notice it's about a century after the Trojan War happened. It's about 400 years after Homer started writing his poems, and it's about 50 years after the founding of the first university. Anyway, it's the Alexander the Great period, and Greek culture is flourishing. There's a Greek empire. In 323, Alexander dies. The empire splits. There are wars. Greek culture continues to spread, though. Egypt, Persia, and India are now reading the Greek stuff. That is, of course, mostly coming out of the Greek Academy and coming from their scholars and poets. And then in 146, Rome conquers Greece with the destruction of Corinth. So far, it's been mostly Greek culture, but now Rome has conquered Greece. So we move from Greek as the dominant language to Latin as the dominant language, but we have moved from Grecian rule kind of in its apex under Alexander the Great, and it is now being ruled by Romans. Okay, so that's 146 BC. About a century later, this guy named Julius Caesar has come around. You've probably heard of him. He's around in the late 50s BC. He's, of course, a successful military leader, but also a dictator. So he's famously assassinated, also famously by his own close friends. That follows a period of chaos. What do you do after your dictator has been assassinated? Well, in 31 BC, there's a big naval fight between a guy named Octavian and Mark Antony and Cleopatra. So Mark Antony and Cleopatra are allies. They had this big naval fight with Octavian. Octavian wins, and he takes on the title of Augustus. So he is Emperor Augustus. He's crowned the emperor. Now, that doesn't happen immediately. There's like this political game. So the wars happened with Mark Antony and Cleopatra, but Augustus eventually wins the hearts and minds of the soldiers. That's important, but also the Senate. And he becomes the emperor in 27 BC. He's now Emperor Augustus. He rules for about 40-ish years, 27 BCE to 14 CE. But his rule starts about 200 years that is called Pax Romana, or kind of 200 years of relative peace where there is a single empire. It is the Roman Empire. Kind of fun to notice that almost exactly overlaps the time Jesus is doing his thing. So he dies in 14 CE, and Jesus, of course, starts becoming a big deal around 30-32 CE. But what is going to happen is that there's the rule of Alexander the Great, the Alexandrian era. Then there's the Augustan era. That's when Rome has asserted its control, and there's a Roman Empire that's going on. And all that happens just before Jesus comes along, and that's when the story that eventually will become Hadestown gets written. Anyway, that rule extends until about 330 Common Era. Constantine moves the capital from Rome to Byzantium, and he renames it Constantinople, and that sets up the They Might Be Giant song that would just have to wait a mere 1,700 years before the recording technology would get good enough that they could do their thing. So let's say there's that Pax Romana period, and it extends till about 330 in the Common Era. And then once Rome gets moved to Constantinople, or the seat of the empire gets moved to Constantinople, we can see that things are shifting. That gets us into the start of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, that's not terribly relevant to our Hadestown story, but it's kind of fun to think about. Simon Duitz, who has an MA from Leiden University, takes us through the Roman Empire. The Christian Church consolidates under Constantine around 400 CE. The Holy Roman Empire consolidates under Charlemagne in about 800-ish CE, so that's the 9th century. And that continues until about 1806. That is when the Habsburgs in the 1700s got kicked out of France. They got established in Prussia and in Silesia. It's barely hanging on when Napoleon crushes them in 1800, and it's all over. And then World War I eliminates the entire idea. But importantly, for our purposes, Jesus Christ Superstar, of course, it takes place right after Emperor Augustus dies. The Adam and Eve story become prominent under the Holy Roman Empire. And so there's a sort of fusing of different Greek mythology, so that we will discover that when Persephone and Eurydice do some stuff, it's kind of a shout out to Christian thoughts, but those are becoming kind of fused as the logical successor to the Roman Empire. Anyway, that's, like our little 10-minute power tour of Greek history, but it goes from the Trojan War is about 1300 BC. Then we've got the founding of the Academy about 387. Then we have Alexander the Great, who's almost immediately after the Academy. They fall to Rome, and the Emperor Augustus takes over about 30 BC. And then there's 200 years of Roman rule that eventually deteriorates into the Holy Roman Empire. That is the history of Greece, and that's going to help us locate when these various events happen, and it's become real important when we start talking about the difference between Virgil's version of the Orpheus story and Ovid's. Okay, that gets to our second main theme of the day, Greek mythology. Oh man, is there a lot of Greek mythology. There's a ton of authors, and then it just gets really complicated, and they're Kronos to Zeus to something, man. It's a little bit beyond me. There's a lot of good sources out there if you want to get deeper into it than you do, but I am going to focus on the four main characters that are in Hadestown. And before I get going, I'll just say there are multiple versions of everything. So everything that I'm going to say, there's probably a different version out there. I'm going to give you one. You can find others, but these are the ones that I think are going to play out in our Hadestown narrative. Okay, so let's start with this. At the time of the Eurydice and Orpheus tale, the world has been divided into three main parts according to the mythology. There's been an insurrection against the Titans, and there are now three gods who are brothers, and they divide everything up. Zeus gets the sky, Poseidon gets the sea, and Hades gets the underworld. And that's where we are at the start of Orpheus and Eurydice. narrative. So let's start with the first of those characters and maybe the least interesting, Hades. Who is Hades? Well, he's one of the three brothers who's now ruling everything. He is the god of the dead, but also the god of riches, and he rules the underworld. So let's think, some psychologists could certainly read something into the god of the dead also being the god of the riches, but that's what Hades is in charge of. And as we will learn later, he's married to Persephone, but that marriage comes about by way of abduction. So there's not too much more we need to know about Hades other than he's a god, he's behaving like sort of a toxic male, and he's in charge of riches and death. Persephone, that is our second character. Much more interesting. So Demeter, I've also heard that pronounced Demeter, we're going to go with Demeter, is the goddess of grain and seasons and harvests. She's like a sister to Zeus, although, again, the chronology is a little weird, but they also have kids together, do Zeus and Demeter, and one of them is Persephone. It's like a Habsburg family tree. Zeus and Demeter and Hades are all brothers and sisters, but Zeus and Demeter, brother and sister, have a daughter together named Persephone, and then Hades abducts and marries Persephone, who I guess is his niece. Anyway, let's not get too hung up on the ancient Greek mythological family trees and their sexual morality. That will be something we need to get back to, and for reasons that will become apparent very quickly. But Persephone is the daughter of Demeter, and Demeter is definitely the goddess of grain and seasons and the harvest. Hades decides that he's going to abduct and marry Persephone, and we will get into a little bit more on that later, but in the aftermath of that, Demeter gets really mad about that, and she appeals to Zeus because Persephone is abducted and is not happy about this marriage. And so Demeter goes to Zeus and says, you got to fix this, man. Zeus comes up with a compromise that is Persephone is going to return to the surface, but she has eaten from the underworld, maybe pomegranate seeds. So she's going to spend, as the compromise, 6 months on Earth and then 6 months in the underworld, and that explains the season. Both Hesiod and Homer would write about her and about this event. I'm going to read from Wikipedia, which is, I don't know, like the Homer of our day. So this quote gives a pretty good summary of the story and everything that's going on. Quote, Hades, god of the underworld, had snatched a screaming Persephone to make her his wife with the permission of Zeus, the girl's father. Demeter was then filled with anger, and so the seasons halted and all living things ceased their growth and began to die. Faced with the extinction of all life on Earth, Zeus sent his messenger Hermes to the underworld to bring Persephone back to her mother. Hades agreed to release her if she had eaten nothing while in his realm, but Persephone had eaten a small number of pomegranate seeds. This bound her to Hades in the underworld for certain months of every year, most likely the dry Mediterranean summer, where plant life is threatened by drought, despite the popular belief that it is autumn or winter. There are several variations on this basic myth. The earliest account, the Homeric Hymn to Demeter, relates that Persephone is secretly slipped a pomegranate seed by Hades, and in Ovid's version, Persephone secretly eats the pomegranate seeds, thinking to deceive Hades, but she was discovered and made to say, end quote. And there you have the story in short form Wikipedia version, and God bless Wikipedia. I was so opposed to it when it came out, but now that we have ChatGPT steamrolling everything intellectual, at least Wikipedia is written by humans, and honestly, I like that. That was a pretty good, shortish summary of what's going on. Anyway, it's no good for Persephone, and it is the origin story for the different seasons. Now, in ancient Greece, there was also a cult dedicated to both Persephone and Eurydice, and again, from our friend Wikipedia, quote, the Eleusinian mysteries, and a mystery here is like a bunch of secret rites that you have to perform to get into the cult, were initiations held every year for the cult of Demeter and Persephone based on the Palhellenic sanctuary of Eleusis, Eleusis, in ancient Greece. They are considered the most famous of the secret religious rites of ancient Greece, end quote. They also had a women's only festival as part of these Eleusinian mysteries. It was the original ladies' night. It was a, bacchanalian get together, drink it up, dance around a lot, have a bunch of fun, maybe a little licentious behavior, but it was women only. And interestingly, Persephone may also be thought of as the poppy goddess now. I'm only saying this because I'm into the connections. I'm not sure I'm going to explore this more, although I hope we can get around to doing that. Poppy goddess, the only poppy goddess that I know of is Glinda the Good, who in The Wizard of Oz, of course, Dorothy's getting stuck in the poppies and she falls asleep with all of her crew. But along shows Glinda the Good makes it snow, and that gets Dorothy out of the poppies. Poppy goddess, is that connected to The Wizard of Oz? I'm gonna look at that, and if I find something out, I'll get back to you. For one thing, and because it is not in the musical, I'm going to mention this. In the Greek version, Persephone is abducted and maybe raped by Hades. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Homer, as is translated by Gregory Nagy, with a couple of ellipses in here, but it goes this way. Persephone is frolicking in the field, and, quote, Persephone, was having a good time along with the daughters of Okeanos, who are wearing their girdles slung low. She was picking flowers, roses, crocuses, and beautiful violets. Up and down the soft meadow, iris blossoms too she picked, and hyacinth, and narcissus, which had grown as a lure for the flower-faced girl by Gaia, the earth. All according to the plans of Zeus. She, Gaia, was doing this as a favor for the one who receives many guests, Hades. All right. Breaking from my quote a little bit. So remember that Hades is the name for one who receives many guests and has many names. We are going back to Homer now. The Narcissus, was a wonderful thing in its splendor. To look at it gives a sense of holy awe to the immortal gods as well as the mortal humans. It had 100 heads growing from the root up. Its sweet fragrance spread over the wide skies above, and the earth below smiled back in all its radiance. So too the churning mass of the salty sea. She, Persephone, was filled with a sense of wonder, and she reached out with both hands to take hold of the pretty plaything. And the earth, full of roads leading every which way, opened up under her, and it happened on the plain of Nysa. All right, I'm breaking from the quote again. So far, that's just fun. Persephone is frolicking, and she's not just kind of like running around the field. She is totally taken with the earth, and the earth itself, Gaia, has gone out of its way at the request of Hades to make it a pleasant day. And it sure is, and Persephone's having fun. It's about to take a dark turn. Back to her quote. There it was that the Lord who receives many guests made his lunge. He was riding on a chariot drawn by immortal horses, the son of Kronos, the one known by many names. He seized her against her will and put her on his golden chariot and drove away as she wept. She cried with a piercing voice, called upon her father Zeus, the son of Kronos, the highest and the best. But not one of the immortal ones, or of human mortals, heard her voice. End quote. Okay, so that's a bad day for Persephone. She is the daughter of Demeter. Hades has done something, like he got Gaia to almost trick Persephone to come out, enjoy nature, and then he abducted her. She is not down with it. It is against her will, and she is screaming. And the fact that nobody responds to her means that Zeus has to later intervene, which is how we get the seasons. So let's just pause and say, what do we know about Persephone? Well, Persephone and Hades do rule the underworld, and they do it together in ancient Greek mythology. But in Homer, it starts with a violent abduction. And Homer's not alone in that. I'm just quoting Homer because it's Homer. Now, I have seen memes that say, imagine writing the first and still read narrative epic novel of all time, and still being only the second most culturally relevant Homer in modern America. Shout out to you, Mr. Simpson. But I'm quoting Homer because the guy's Homer. And so there you have it. This ancient story, which comes from the mouth of Homer, or from the pen, I guess, of Homer. I will also say I am aware that some people believe that Homer himself might be a myth and doesn't exist. But let's just say there are poems attributed to Homer. That's one of them. It's been translated. And in that story, the marriage of Persephone and Hades does not start well. That is not referenced very much in the musical, and we'll get back to why that might be important in future episodes. Okay, so we got Hades, got to the underworld. We got Persephone, who is the daughter of Demeter and a deity who's in charge of nature. Eurydice is the daughter of Persephone, and she is a nymph. That makes her a nature deity. She's sort of the personification of nature, and she's a deity, but she is mortal, so she can die, so kind of quasi-divine. As a nymph, by some sources, she is the daughter of Apollo, and that would make it gross, because if Orpheus is also a son of Apollo, which is, again, hinted in some sources, but not others, that would make them brother and sister, so more Habsburging going on, which we will, again, not get too bogged down in this episode, other than to note there's a lot of brothers and sisters and nieces and uncles that are hooking up in ancient Greek mythology. Now, in many tellings, she gets married to Orpheus while she is dancing in a field. And in some, she is pursued by a guy named Aristeus. He's the son of Zeus, and he's a guy who is into beekeeping. All right, so Orpheus is a son of Zeus. Aristeus is also a son of Zeus. And they are both pursuing Eurydice. Aristeus is into beekeeping, and he's chasing after Eurydice, who is either married to Orpheus or not quite married to Orpheus. But anyway, either while she's frolicking in the pasture by herself or while she's being pursued by Aristeus, she steps on a snake, and the snake definitely kills her. So there's not a ton on Eurydice that is backstory prior to her meeting Orpheus, other than the fact that she is a nymph, and she was definitely killed by stepping on a snake. And that might be important because that is not how she dies in the story. All right, so we've gotten through 3 of our main characters in the story so far. That only leaves your boy Orpheus, the hero of this story. Now, he is definitely got a lot of stuff going on. He is from Thrace, which is way north in Greece. So it's all the way up in the top of Greece. I think modern day, it's kind of part of it's in Turkey. His mother is Calliope. Calliope is a muse, and his dad is either a Thracian king, but maybe Apollo, depending on who you read. But either way, he's got music in his blood. His mother is a muse. He's probably trained by Apollo, who's also a god of music. So he's got music that is built into his blood, and he gets all the music genes and a golden lyre to play on. So his music is not just good. His music is really, really good. He's like Bob Dylan and the Beatles and Tupac Shakur all rolled into one. His music moves humans, it moves animals, it moves nature. Like literally, animals stop what they're doing to listen to him play. Rocks roll over to hear him. The Rolling Stones, he makes the stones roll to come to hear him and listen to him play. And of course, it makes humans cry, and it stops arguments. It does a bunch of other things. He is the original rock star. He's the guitar man. Night after night, he does it right. He can make you laugh. He can make you cry. He can drag you down. He can get you high. He's the jazz man who testifies and makes a faithless man believe. I am not going to apologize for my digression into 70s era lyrics. Anyway, Orpheus, the first thing about him is he's this fantastic musician. He is a musician gifted by the gods. So that is his dominant feature, but he does have 3 things that he does that are important. Number 1, he travels with Jason and the Argonauts. Like seriously, he travels with Jason and the Argonauts. And this happens just before the Trojan War. So Jason and the Argonauts in the ancient stories, they go on their quest and then they come back and then the Trojan War starts. So just before the Trojan War starts, which puts Orpheus as right around the time of the Trojan War, he is traveling with Jason. Now, why does he travel? Well, in 300 BC, there's a writer named Apollonius Rhodius, and he wrote an epic called, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Argonautica, which I think is the tale of the Argonauts. Now, Orpheus is actually the first Argonaut that Jason picks. Like like you're lining up for dodgeball, and it's like, okay, who are we going to take with us on this grand quest, says Jason. And he starts with Orpheus, and Orpheus does 2 important things. Whenever these big egoed warriors start fighting with each other, Orpheus starts playing his music, and then they all stop and they grab their beers and they start hugging each other and they start crying and they're like, I love you, man. This song is so great. Orpheus's music can stop these big, egomaniacal, brutal guys from fighting with each other, which is what Jason needs to make his trip a success. And just as importantly, he's got to get past the sirens. The sirens are going to trick people with their beautiful songs. So he needs a musician that is good enough that he can trick the sirens. And it turns out that Orpheus, of course, successfully does that, which is why Jason makes it back home and was able to make one of the truly great claymation movies on the basis of that myth. All right. Number 1, Orpheus travels with the Argonauts, not in or even referenced in the musical, but man, is that some backstory. Number 2, he, of course, has a relationship with Eurydice, and this is the core of the musical. Now, he wants to get married. Eurydice wants to marry him, and they want to make it a big deal, so he kind of goes out of his way to have this huge ceremony. There are some implications in some of the stories. This is an indication of his ego, that this dude, and he's a rock star in all ways, including great big ego. And so when he gets married, he wants a bunch of people there, and he wants to make it a big deal. So he invites this person named Hymen, who is the god of marriage, and he asks Hymen, hey, you're the god of marriage. Will you bless my wedding to Eurydice? Hymen decides that he can't do it, which is a foreboding event. If the god of marriage won't bless your marriage, how come? That's no good. Well, it turns out Hymen was right because, of course, as we've mentioned, Eurydice then gets bitten by a snake and dies. But and this is where the story heats up. Orpheus follows her to the underworld, and by all accounts, he gets this deal with Hades where it's like, you can lead Eurydice out, but you can't hold her hand, and you can't look back. And if you look back, then the deal's off, and she has to go to hell forever. He almost makes it, but at the very last minute, Orpheus turns around, looks at her, and she is now dead forever, or his death then follows. It's much later. Some say months, some say 7 months, some say 7 years, some say 3 years. I've seen many sources on this, but he does not live to a ripe old age. His Eurydice is taken from him, and he wanders all around for a while, just totally bummed out. And then his death happens when he is definitely ripped apart by a mob of angry women, like torn to pieces and decapitated. So let's go back to our faithful friend Wikipedia and listen to this description. Quote, he's torn apart and he's decapitated. Quote, his head, still singing mournful songs, floated along with his lyre down the river Hebrus into the sea, after which the winds and the waves carried them to the island of Lesbos at the city of Methymna. There, the inhabitants buried his head, and a shrine was built in his honor near Antissa. There, his oracle prophesied until it was silenced by Apollo. In addition to the people of Lesbos, Greeks from Ionia and Aetolia consulted the oracle, and his reputation spread as far as Babylon. Orpheus's lyre was carried to heaven by the Muses and was placed among the stars. End quote. Now, none of that's in the musical, but boy, isn't that a lot of stuff. He is ripped apart. His head floats to the Isle of Lesbos. It gets buried. There's also a story in there where a snake's going to bite him, but Apollo intercedes and turns the snake to stone. But the head is buried nonetheless on the Isle of Lesbos. There's an altar built above it. It becomes an oracle, and it prophesies. And then there's a religion based on that, which we'll get to later. And then eventually the head, his lyre is carried into heaven and placed among the stars. All right. So that's what happens with Orpheus and Eurydice. Now, the third thing, which I mentioned briefly there, is that there was then a massive cult based on him. Again, from Wikipedia, quote, Orpheus was a founder and prophet of the so-called Orphic mysteries. He was credited, and breaking out of the quote here, but remember, a mystery is a series of ancient rites that have to be performed. So if you're looking to the Eleusinian mysteries of Demeter and Eurydice, those are secret rites that get performed by this cult of followers that are designed to get them into the cult, get them higher knowledge and closer to the goddess, in the case of Eurydice and Persephone, into the goddesses of fertility. And for the Orphic mysteries, it's to get you closer to this god who's got prophetic power. Okay, I'm going back to the quote. He's the founder of the Orphic mysteries. Quote, he was credited with the composition of a number of works, among which are a number of now lost theogonies, including the theogony commented upon in the Der Veni Papyrus, as well as extant works such as the Orphic Hymns and Orphic Argonautica and Lithica. Shrines containing purported relics of Orpheus were regarded as oracles. End quote. So Orpheus dies, his head is buried, and there's an entire Orphic cult that follows him for centuries. He's a quasi-religious, quasi-messianic figure. All right, that's the third thing. I think I said there was three things, right? Okay, there's actually a fourth that we will again have to get back to. And again, it's going to get a little, let's just say gross by 21st century standards. Number 4, he is a pederast. In fact, he is called the first pederast. This does not happen in all the stories. He has not become a pederast. But in at least one very important version of the story, he is definitely a pederast. And the story goes, he is way too sad about Eurydice dying to take up with a serious female lover, so instead he has sex with boys, and that makes it cool when he's going to reunite with Eurydice after she dies. Does it sound like there's a lot to unpack there? Oh my, yes there is. We will get to that in bulk later in the next episode. For now, let's just put a pin in it. If you saw Hadestown, you probably know Orpheus was a good musician. That was his defining characteristic. Did you know that he went with Jason and the Argonauts? Did you know that a religion was founded on the basis of his head being buried on the island of Lesbos? Lesbos, that has some interesting etymology, right? Like, in case I'm getting too nerdy, yes, the word lesbian in our contemporary use does come from the Isle of Lesbos, not a coincidence merely. That's where his head's buried, probably not. And he also becomes the first pederast. All of that part of the Orpheus myth in Greek legend, but not part of Hadestown. There remains the question of, was he a real guy? Well, it's kind of hard to tell. The ancient Greeks talked about everybody as if they were a real guy, including Zeus. They believed that the gods were real, and the Minotaurs and the Cyclops and all those, they thought they were real. Why not? Aristotle, interestingly, did not believe he was a real guy, but it's clear that everybody else pretty much did. If he's a real guy, he lived generations before Homer, so there aren't great birth records from back then. It is notable that Homer writes about him. Plato did write about him in the Phaedrus, which is, of course, Phaedrus being the Greek god of motorcycle maintenance. I hope you got that reference, but Plato's account is way less flattering, so that just about everybody, including the person who identified him as a pederast, thinks that Orpheus is pretty cool, or at least he's a very tragic but very talented musician. Not Plato. Plato just kind of thought that he sucked. But it is interesting that both Plato and Aristotle are writing about him, and at least at the time of the First Greek Academy, he's just kind of considered a historical figure. Okay, time for the recap. Here's the quick review. These are the parts of the tale that are part of almost every version of the story that existed in Greek mythology. Persephone is always the daughter of Demeter and is responsible for the Earth's fertility. The seasons come and go because Persephone has to ping-pong back and forth between the planet Earth and Hades. In all versions of the stories, Persephone is forcefully abducted by Hades. Zeus intervenes on behalf of Demeter, and she has to spend 6 months in Hades and 6 months on Earth as part of the deal, and that explains the seasons. In all versions, Orpheus has divine mystical power. He falls in love with Eurydice, and she dies by a snake bite and then goes to Hades. Orpheus then follows her into hell, plays a song that convinces Hades to give him a chance, and Hades makes a deal. It's a test. It's not a trick. It's a test. You can leave, and you can take Eurydice with you as long as you don't look back. But in all versions, the dude does look back. Eurydice dies, and he wanders around for a long while, for some period of time, being really sad and playing music. Everybody loves that music. It makes everything sad, including the rocks and the trees and the animals and the humans. But definitely everyone's sad, and his songs are great. He meets his end by being torn apart by an angry mob of women. His head ends up singing, continues to sing after his death, and it ends up on the Isle of Lesbos. It becomes an oracle, and a religion is founded based on him. That is sort of the common canon of the Orpheus story. Those are things that come out of Greek mythology in pretty much in a stock way. Now, just to finish our review, let's get to the parts that are in that story, but are not in Hadestown. Eurydice is bitten by a snake. Of course, it is crucial to the plot of Hadestown that she gets to hell in a different way. She makes a deal with Hades where she agrees to go there because she's stricken with poverty. That is definitely not part of the original Greek tale. Persephone is abducted. Now, there is definitely some reference to tension between Persephone and Hades, but the fact that it started with an abduction and maybe a rape as part of their relationship, that is definitely downplayed in the musical. Orpheus becomes a pederast after Eurydice dies. That's not in the musical. Orpheus is torn about by women. It's not there. He becomes basis for a religious cult. In fact, there's nothing in the musical about Orpheus after he looks back. In the musical, that is the end of the story. And the last thing I'll say is that we can also safely say that he's the most rounded character in the story. He's got the most backstory. He's the hero, and the actions of everybody else kind of center around him. Okay, this is our quick review of Greek history and Greek mythology. Naas Mitchell, when she was writing the show, knew that part of what she had to do, and she actually wrote a book in 2020 where she explains how she came up with the lyrics to the song and the little changes along the way. But part of what the challenge of remaking any myth, and certainly one that Mitchell was facing, was if you're going to tell a story about Greek mythology, you have to establish the rules of the ancient Greek world, and you have to identify who the players are. Like, you can't just say Persephone and imagine that everybody's going to know who Persephone is. You have to at least give some part of the backstory to lock that down. So Mitchell walks into this array of source material, and she's got a bunch of creative choices to make. In the end, she makes a bunch of choices that will express her own person, her own personality, her own concerns. They will express contemporary issues in a powerful way that obviously resonated with audiences. I have said in prior episodes, not everybody loves Andrew Lloyd Webber. That's true. Everybody loves Naas Mitchell. You can find people that will take shots at some choices that they made, but she's got a clear dedication to her craft, a clear dedication to trying to make this story work. Some heartbreak along the way, getting the show to the stage. But the important thing now is we are now at the point that Mitchell was at when she walked into the story. I've got all of this Greek mythology. What am I going to do with it to make it relevant to my contemporary world and tell the story that I want to tell? This is what Mitchell has to do. This is the point we are at, but we are not yet at the point where we're going to walk the same path that Mitchell did. Before we get to Naas Mitchell, we are going to have to review the original poets. What's the original story of Orpheus, you ask? Well, that depends on whether you ask Virgil or whether or not you ask Ovid. And we are going to ask both of them in our next episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.